Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogues Season 2, Episode 14. I'm Daniel Helmig. In a social science lab experiment a few years ago, participants were asked several questions about their concerns about global warming and climate change. They were asked on different days, on hot days and on cold days. And then with either the heating or the AC system cranked up in the room where they answered the questions. Guess what? There was a highly statistically relevant result that people were more concerned with climate change when they felt warm. When asked later whether they think the temperature impacted their overall concerns regarding climate change, nearly all participants negated any effect when answering the question in the first place. So much for unconscious bias. And here I am, doing just another podcast on greenhouse gas emission net zero in winter, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So, dear Australians, Africans, Indians, South Americans, New Zealanders, and citizens of Florida, this one is especially for you. And for all the other listeners, let's just do not listen to the unconscious, okay? As I said, we're talking this time in winter and ignoring the science when we look at just another angle of how to get to net zero in Scope 3 in the supply chain, called Subcategory 3.1. Whoa, I hear some of you thinking, there are subcategories? Yes, there are, and quite a lot. So why don't we just give Amy, my AI-generated co-host voice for the show, the honors to explain them.
Daniel mentioned Category 3.1, Purchased Goods and Services. In total, there are 11 subcategories in Scope 3, including upstream and downstream transportation, waste generation, business travel, employee commute to and from work. Then we have emissions from using products the organization sells, such as energy consumption during product use or disposal methods, and last, but not least, end-of-life treatment of sold products. So, as often pointed out in this podcast, Scope 3 is the elephant in the room in most companies when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions.
What is always amazing for me is that the COP, governments, and many industry associations say, let's focus on Scope 1 and 2 because we can control it ourselves, while all the other stuff, which is outside, is too difficult for us. Looking at the results of the efforts of most companies, I've always experienced it is much easier to change supplier requirements than get the whole company entirely on the same page. I'm talking about red tape and prioritization issues. With the external side, it's much simpler. Get to net zero or we stop sourcing from you in 3 to 5 years. That gets everyone's attention in the Scope 3 partner firms. Many people believing in the success of Scope 1 and 2 focus will point out, look, let our external partners do their homework as we do ours, and then voila, we will get naturally to the net zero in Scope 3. If you belong to this group and still are interested in having your children live on a planet at least partially resembling the living conditions we have today, plus raising living conditions for our fellow brothers and sisters in Asia, India, and Africa, which is still 50% plus of the world's population, I put together a few questions that you can pose to your large suppliers to get a feel for, well, whether they are really getting involved in what you think or whether they need some tough love, as I suggest. Just test run a couple of these questions or all with your large product suppliers, and I guess you will have quite a rude awakening. Amy will go through the questions and I will give you some subtext, as always, to what you look for in the answers.
Who, if anyone, is leading your company's greenhouse gas emission net zero strategy? Who will get fired or promoted based on performance in this dimension?
Suppose their CEO does not give the direction and does not kick behinds and take names. In that case, it will be tough for all the people in their sales, manufacturing, R&D, and supply chain to put net zero on the agenda besides all the other competing targets they must have. If the answer is, our sustainability department is doing it, our finance department, our real estate or manufacturing organization, be advised that they do not have a chance. Their leadership seems to be taking the topic of net zero like the blind people who stand around an elephant. And yes, I agree, this is an elephant-heavy episode, no pun intended. Depending on what they touch, they say it's a tree, a snake, a rope, a spear, a fan, or a wall. But in reality, no one really figures out how to basically drive the whole topic, which is the whole elephant.
Do you know your emission levels for Scope 1, 2, and 3? And if you do not know it yet, what is the plan?
There will be few to no suppliers who will know the total emissions of their Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3, no way. If anyone claims differently, get the evidence. Either you have a unicorn supplier and then check as well for rainbows and leprechauns, or you have another company you should not trust. Truthful suppliers will point out that they are not there yet, and then it will be interesting to see whether they have a plan to close the gap. No plan? Expect no results in the foreseeable future, right? And additionally, that is just the start. First, need to understand that you have a problem before you can do something about it. So suppose they only have a plan to get to a good understanding of the emissions by, say, 5 years. In that case, you need another 5 to 10 years before they will get to net zero, if at all. And that means they have a prioritization from their CEO, which is highly unlikely if they do not have a plan today. Maybe they have a new CEO by then, most probably because the average tenure of CEOs is about 4 years.
On what is your reporting methodology based? How many standards do you follow?
Again, you look for an educated answer. Here are some of the indications that they might not have a good handle on this. Too many different standards, or not one leading standard. Especially difficult it's going to be if they only have a national standard they comply with.
What software do you use to report and track?
Different systems for internal and external measurement and reporting is a warning sign. Also, they need top-notch software to track and change. Here, and I can say that because I'm not getting paid by them, I recommend CarbMe, CARBMEE, to look into. It is, in my view, one of the best tracking and reporting companies and software for greenhouse gas emissions for Scope 3 and as well Scope 1 and 2.
What are your top 3 change areas in Scope 3? What is the reduction potential versus your overall emission volume? How do you address suppliers producing in a country with mainly fossil fuel electricity and heating processes?
These questions belong together and are building on each other to some extent. If the business partner cannot name the 3 biggest areas of emissions in Scope 3 and how they relate overall to the total emissions, they are not really engaged in transformative change. Yeah, they can work on business travel or EV cars for management, but the real question is, how do you deal with suppliers and transportation with high emission levels? What is your game plan? Whether it is working with a supplier, changing suppliers, changing material design, or moving manufacturing or to countries where less fossil fuel-heavy electricity is created, like Canada, France, Switzerland, Sweden, etc. What are you doing after breakfast? Or do you just hope for the best?
Can we get to net zero by 2030 or earlier?
This is to some extent a trick question. This podcast is produced in January 2024, so there are still 6 years until the decade is behind us. There's not one sourcing category or transportation process that could not be changed to net zero in the next 6 years. In most fields, it takes even less. All it takes for the company is relentless dedication to net zero while adding cost and quality to the overall equation. The equation is solvable for every category. Even those that might take a bit longer, like steel or sea transportation, can be offset easily by carbon capture technology. Again, here my plug for Climeworks. I have a mechanical engineering solution to extract CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it back into the ground, where it mostly originated from in the first place. So you are testing their resolve with this question.
How do you communicate, update, and engage with groups like suppliers, all company employees, senior management, and investors?
Like customers, quality and cost focus, net zero focus is all-encompassing. Every stakeholder should be engaged or at least be informed. Why is this important? Because it is better to have thousands of people working on a solution than just one department. And it keeps each other's eyes on the task.
How is the rest of the firm involved? What is the role of research and development, market intelligence, strategy department, sales, finance, and the divisions or individual businesses?
It is, as well as pointed out before, quite revealing if the topic of net zero is a corporate rather than a product and business topic. Becoming net zero means, in a lot of areas, transformative change. Solutions can propel your company to new levels of competitiveness if done holistically, or they've just been seen as additional cost drivers and a nuisance to put in place by regulators. Then you will see in the company that there is probably just one small department, sustainability whatsoever, trying to make a difference, completely frustrated because the rest of the grown-ups are not interested.
These were all the questions we selected this time.
Thanks, Amy. As I said at the beginning, try some or all of the questions with some of your most important suppliers. You can as well do a backflip here and check your own company and how it is set up with regard to the questions. It's as well a good indicator to keep you honest. After you've done the rounds with your supplier partners, and I would say 4 to 10 interviews are enough, look at your results. And then you can ask yourself, we, as humankind, already have blown past the targets that were set in the Paris Accord for maximum 1.5 degrees. But we can at least reduce the onslaught of further impact for the generations to come by now starting to turning back the CO2 emissions with smart technology and supply chain measures. At the end, this whole situation just unfolded in the last 30 years, since the 90s. So who says we cannot put the genie back into the bottle? But to do this, we need the strongest force of the business universe, which is competition, combined with one of the strongest incentives for humans, greed. Set realistic targets for net zero to your supply base and open the door for competition. Who gets there first with competitive cost will get your orders. And there you have then the greed factor. Everyone likes to have more revenue and hates to inform their supervisors about another account loss due to the indecisiveness with regard to something that actually is not that difficult to manage in the first place, which is net zero. I've done with my teams a lot of cost estimating and bill of material analysis. Energy costs are in most products you buy only up to 5% of the overall cost, often even more in the 1 to 2% range. There is no reason why this cannot be managed by most companies in a better way. Lastly, and while I'm absolutely sure that Scope 3 net zero can be reached much before 2050 in the interest of our children and grandchildren, we still have to use change management with our partners, our supply base, to get there. Just setting thresholds is not good enough. You as well have to help some of your suppliers to get started. Educate them, train them, help them, engage with their leadership. To do this, however, it means as well that you need to be trained, educated, and have the backing of your leadership. With that, you can become a net zero hero in your company, and as well for your family, by being the engine for change. Because if not you, then who? If you plan to get going and wonder what to do first, second, etc. on this journey, here's a quick and dirty plan. If you like more, either listen to some of the other podcasts we have on this topic or give us a call. First, you have to set up a team led by the CPO or the COO with full-time project lead and 3 to 5 full-time employees. This doesn't come cheap if you want to do it right. Second, do your homework with all the stakeholders. So not just something which is being done somewhere in the cubbyhole and then being shared. No, it has to be officially named, because people, for example, need to understand that Scope 3 emissions are dwarfing anything that is being done normally in the company. Third, you need to educate the board and the EXB to define the art of the possible And bringing in external experts is good, or let them go, for example, on a field trip and just look at companies that can do net zero. Next, 4 is then set ambitious targets and communicate them. Again, we're talking about children and grandchildren. We're talking about the planet as such. So why don't we just have the guts to actually set these ambitious targets, these hairy targets, and go for it? 5th, we need to change now the rules of the game inside of the company. So code of conducts have to change, both internally and as well for the suppliers. The templates in terms of how you source and how you basically assess suppliers, selection criteria, statements of work need to be changed and updated, all aligned with your set of net zero categorization, which is being defined then by CDP or ISO, whatever you use as your standard. Then point 6 is that you have to build a supplier net zero assistance team. You can choose some of the people that you have already defined up front in the team, but it will over time probably grow. At some point in time, the more maturity we have on this topic, you will as well find external service providers that can help other suppliers to get to net zero. But right now, in 2024, there isn't that much on the market yet. The change management plan is then number 7. And there are a couple of topics. First, you do a Pareto in terms of scope 3 subcategories to figure out where actually the biggest opportunity lies. Then you go by sourcing category groupings. So inside of the overall 3.1, you have to look at the categories which have the highest impact in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, if you could change that. Then you look at updating job roles and competency definitions, because the people that you want to work on getting you to net zero need to know more and sometimes different things than what they're knowing today. Then you have to build up digitalization and automation around the game plan, because you don't want to do this on Excel sheets. That's impossible to do. And last but not least, build in emission pricing in all aspects of the company's cost structure. Now that brings us to point 8. When you have that all done, report regularly in and externally. Hold your own feet to the fire here. And then next is, when you're doing this quite well, celebrate at some point in time being net zero before your competition in this decade. And then last and least, number 10 is then sell the hell out of this accomplishment in the marketplace. It is easy, right? Well, not exactly. But it is as well very much like everything else that needs to be done when changes arise and you need to move the tanker into a different direction. So let's just do it. When we did an episode without an interview partner, we talked about unsung heroes so far. People that helped me in my career. Each stands for many people who do similar things for all of us on our way through the game we call work. Based on the feedback we received from you, I think that the message we were sending was received. Hence, we will no longer do individuals beside this one last one. This is one of my unsung heroes overall. This is to thank Shankar Vedantam, the author of the book Hidden Brain and the podcast with the same name. He operationalized this concept of unsung heroes and made me realize how many people are linked to our success, as well as just making our life livable. Shankar, you are a true inspiration for all podcasters, and I can only recommend the podcast Hidden Brain to anyone who is interested in the human condition. Over the 300 plus episodes, I've learned more about social sciences and myself than I ever believed possible. Thank you, Shankar, and all the unsung heroes that help you to do what you do. With that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Supply Chain Dialogues. If you did, please subscribe, if not already done before. Share it with a colleague, friend, or any decision makers you know in your company. Stay safe, be bold, and see you in 2 weeks. These are the Supply Chain Dialogues, produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory AG in 2024.